Good evening, and welcome to the very first diplomatic discussion of the school year. There's something very exciting about this, but the most exciting thing is to see this room filled with all of you. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Barbara Stevenson, and I'm the Vice Provost for Global Affairs and Chief Global Officer here at Carolina. Diplomatic discussions are part of Carolina's diplomacy initiative, which gives students a chance to grapple with the grand challenges of our time. We gather this evening as the decades-long neoliberal consensus has come under sustained attack from nearly every direction. If no one during my 34 years as an American diplomat questioned the so-called Washington consensus in favor of deregulation and trade liberalization, now, rather suddenly, nearly everyone does. We've hosted right here in the Nelson Mandela Auditorium some of the critics of the neoliberal order or Washington consensus. Last fall's marquee diplomatic discussion featured Ambassador Catherine Tai, the U.S. trade representative, a member of President Biden's cabinet. She argued that neoliberalism had gone too far, harming workers in America and allowing China to be a free rider. And before that, we hosted Rana Foroohar, who spoke about her new book, Homecoming, which likewise argued that China's entry into the World Trade Organization, quote, removed the guardrails from the global economy. To recover, she argued, we need to rethink the balance between growth and security, between efficiency and resilience. Now, these are big ideas about how open the world trading system should be. And if you listened to the debate last night, you heard candidates supporting protectionism and tariffs on incoming goods, ideas directly at odds with the neoliberal consensus that held sway, really largely unchallenged, from the 1990s through passage of the last free trade agreements, including the U.S.-Panama Free Trade Agreement, which I worked on as U.S. Ambassador to Panama until 2010. Now, as globalization took hold, the percentage of people in the world living in abject poverty dropped from 38% to 8.4%. And the global inflation rate, it fell from above 25% to around 4% and stayed there for decades. I point out these benefits of globalization because, as Daniel Drezner, tonight's speaker, writes in a terrific article in the February 2024 edition of Reason magazine, quote, anyone advocating neoliberal policies is now persona non grata in Washington, D.C. My own kids say, Mama, don't say that. So we don't advocate for free trade. They'll take away my card. Now, whenever I see a dramatic shift, like everybody's on board with an idea like the longstanding Washington consensus in favor of neoliberalism, to almost everybody being opposed to it, my antenna go up. So maybe we did overshoot the mark in our longstanding enthusiasm for neoliberalism. In fact, I'm pretty sure we did. But I hate to abandon something as important to the open world order and your futures without an informed discussion. We are really lucky tonight to have the opportunity to have an informed discussion about this important topic. I want to first thank Peter Koklanis, the Albert Newsom Distinguished Professor of History here at Carolina, for introducing me to Daniel Drezner's work. As director of the Global Research Institute and co-sponsor this evening, Peter has been an invaluable thought partner, and he's a wonderful colleague. The Global Research Institute is an applied think tank with a mission to produce and disseminate knowledge on important global issues. Lately, the Global Research Institute has focused on better understanding whither globalization, where is the liberal world order heading? Which brings us to the main event. We get to hear about this topic from Dr. Daniel Drezner, who has a keen intellect and a great delivery style, and he's not cowed into silence by the shifting whims of the foreign policy establishment. Daniel Drezner is Distinguished Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. He's also co-director of the Fletcher School's Russia and Eurasia program. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs and an academic partner at State Street Associates. Prior to Tufts, Dr. Drezner taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Colorado at Boulder. He's written 7 books, and he's published articles in numerous scholarly journals and periodicals. He earned a bachelor's degree in political economy from Williams College before earning his master's in economics and PhD in political science, both from Stanford. Tonight, Professor Drezner is here to help us wrestle with the question, globalization, RIP? Together, we'll consider the past, present, and future of U.S. foreign economic policy. We'll consider some of the pros and cons of globalization and try to understand what they mean for the world in 2024. After Dr. Drezner gives remarks with a great slide deck, he's going to sit over here, and I'm going to join him for this brief fireside chat where I'll ask a couple of questions. But then we're going to take questions from the audience. I want you to start making notes and thinking about those because you're going to line up behind these microphones and ask questions. So with those marching instructions, please join me in welcoming Dr. Daniel Drezner.
Thank you all very much for coming. I'm glad to see that the homework loads have not been too great in early September, that you can all show up. And again, the combination of diplomacy and Southern hospitality is almost overwhelming to a Yankee like myself, but it's good to be here. So, for the students in the audience, not those people in the front row, but the students in the audience, globalization has been just sort of a constant for your entire lives. It's just something you almost take for granted. It didn't even occur to you that it could change in any way. And just to be clear, by globalization, I'm defining this as the reduction of barriers to goods, services, and ideas, and in some cases, people across borders. Simply put, over time, from about the end of World War II on, every year it has gotten easier and easier for producers in one country to trade or exchange with people in another country. It's become easier for ideas to spread. It's also become easier occasionally for people to get jobs in other countries. And as I said, this was a constant, but now we're beginning to wonder, is this changing? There are certainly surface signs. You might be aware that Donald Trump got elected president in 2016, and he was a big fan of tariffs. If you watched the presidential debate last night, his enthusiasm for tariffs, if anything, has increased. In fact, the good way to think about Donald Trump is that for those of you who have ever seen My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Donald Trump likes tariffs the same way the Greek father in that movie likes Windex. Okay? He thinks tariffs can solve everything. And in terms of policy, it's not just his rhetoric. We've also seen it in terms of what the United States has done. The United States started vetoing appointees to the appellate board of the WTO, beginning not with Donald Trump, but in fact with Barack Obama, and then continuing with Trump and continuing with the Biden administration. So as a result, the premier dispute settlement understanding for globalization, you could argue, no longer works. There are no appellate court judges anymore because the U.S. has vetoed all of them. The result is a sort of system of global governance that seems to be, let's just say, graying and fraying. There's also the issue of security, by the way, and this is not a minor thing. Since the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel, the Houthis based in Yemen have basically said, we will fire missiles against any commercial shipping going through the Red Sea that we feel is, affiliated with a country that supports Israel. As a result, the overwhelming bulk of shipping no longer travels through the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal, which, remember, was designed so that ships could avoid the Cape of Good Hope, a much longer and more expensive journey. And that's not the only example where you're seeing military statecraft, for lack of a way of putting it, really has serious effects on globalization. Think of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline by, we don't know who, the Ukrainians, we don't know who. And yet, despite all of this, and there's been a lot of change in terms of rhetoric, in terms of policy, and in terms of security, the interesting thing about globalization is that it seems to just sort of keep on chugging. So the data there is from the DHL Connectedness Index. Every year, they release something indicating just how much is crossing borders. Now, this thing doesn't have a laser pointer, never mind. If you take a look, the trend lines all show basically continued increased flows in terms of people, in terms of capital, in terms of information, and still in terms of traded goods. All right, so despite all of these efforts by policy, you're not necessarily seeing a slowing down in actual globalization. And why is this? Part of the thing you have to realize, and this is something that we in political science occasionally forget to mention to our students, is that policy is only one variable among many. All right? You can try your darndest to stop flows of global trade or services or people, but there are other things that might drive that and sort of overwhelm it. If technology continues to improve so that the cost of shipping goods across borders continues to decline, it doesn't matter if you increase tariffs. Trade is still going to continue. If it becomes easier through finance to obtain credit, to borrow, to be able to spend and consume more, again, that's not going to, tariffs aren't going to affect that. And in terms of security, if it just becomes easier to trade without concerns about piracy, well, guess what? You can raise tariffs, you can try to impose restrictions, you're still going to have more globalization. So what we are witnessing now might be a replay of past eras where, in fact, there were substantive policy efforts to reduce globalization, and yet in the end, those policy efforts wound up not mattering. So the first picture shows the 1890s. They're really proud of the Eiffel Tower. That's state-of-the-art technology. Beginning in 1880, most countries across Europe started dramatically raising their tariffs. They started launching trade wars with each other. There was just generally a fear of excessive interdependence, and very little that actually mattered. You still had overall trade flows going up during that period. There was some slight redistribution, so Russia and Germany stopped trading with each other, but there was still significant amounts of globalization going on. The picture to your right is from the 1970s. Most of you weren't born during that era. Just thank yourselves for that. But with the end of Bretton Woods, you saw the United States and a whole host of other countries launch a sort of variety of new trade measures, things like trigger price mechanisms or voluntary export restraints or the multi-fiber agreement in terms of textiles. That was a Lulu. And yet, again, overall trade levels, overall globalization still increased during that period. Not quite as much as it did during the Bretton Woods era, but it still went up by a fair amount. Now, I've been upbeat before about the ability and the resilience of globalization. After the 2008 financial crisis, I wrote a book called The System Worked, arguing that despite neoliberalism's many flaws, including the fact that the financial system was not regulated well enough to allow the subprime mortgage crisis to metastasize, that a confluence of things were going to keep globalization open. That essentially the most powerful actor in the world, the United States, still had a vested interest in an open global economy. The key interest groups, not just in the United States, but also in places like Europe and China, because of globalized supply chains, also had a vested interest in keeping the global economy open. And finally, the fact that there was no alternative set of ideas, even in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, that really had any sort of traction. And so as a result, for the first 5 years after the 2008 financial crisis, indeed the first 8 years you could argue, globalization largely chugged along, and indeed the system worked. There's a very famous economic historian named Charles Kindleberger who talks about what you want to see during a financial crisis. And among other things, you want to see markets kept open for distressed goods and the provision of credit. And that is exactly what happened after the 2008 financial crisis. So, maybe I'm just being, needlessly nervous. Except my thesis is that this time is different. Because without question, we still live in a highly globalized era. I'm not trying to say it's ended. But I don't like, if I compare questions about the distribution of power, the distribution of interest, and the distribution of ideas, I am far more nervous now than I was a decade ago when I was, when the system work came out. Part of this is that all these three factors are now pushing the global economy towards closure. So much so that even globalization's critics back during the day are now like, we didn't mean this. They're starting to blanch at what's going on. And frankly, we have yet to game out just how dangerous things might be going forward. Okay, so to be fair, as I said, the global financial crisis happens in 2008, globalization chugs along. 2016 is really when you start seeing the first, headwinds in terms of globalization. Both the passage of the Brexit referendum in the spring of 2016, and then, of course, Donald Trump's election in the fall of 2016, which he interpreted as a mandate for actually implementing a variety of trade wars. And then, of course, in 2020, we have the pandemic, which seemed like a surefire way to curtail trade. And indeed, if you take a look at this, chart from the Peterson Institute for International Economics, if you think of sort of 2008, post-2008, as, the sort of an inflection point in terms of the global economy, the most optimistic thing you could say, and that comes from the DHL data, is that globalization has remained high, but it's plateaued. Sort of acceleration has stopped. It's sort of running just on momentum. And if you look only at trade as opposed to other things, well, then, as they put it, we're in an era of slowbalization, in which, economies are growing faster than trade. So what happened? Why are we here now? Well, again, in the system worked, I argued you got to look at power, you got to look at interest, and you got to look at ideas. And those things look different in 2024 than they did in 2008. In 2008, the argument I made was that the U.S. remained a hegemonic power. One of the things that a lot of people got wrong in 2008 and afterwards was the belief that, U.S. hegemony has ended. Now it's going to be a multipolar world and so on and so forth. No, by almost any economic criteria, the U.S. remained the most important power, and it was not close. If you look now, however, we are operating in an era of what I would describe as unequal bipolarity. And by the way, anyone who tells you it's a multipolar world doesn't understand what the word multipolar means. All right? There's the United States, which is still really powerful. There is China, which is not quite as powerful, but definitely powerful. And then there's a lot of other players. If you look at capital markets, the U.S. remains the most important hegemonic actor. The U.S. has the deepest, most liquid capital markets. The U.S. dollar remains the reserve currency of the world. Yeah, China's rising, but no one really wants to use the renminbi unless they're being under sanctions. Right. But on the other hand, if you look at other areas like production and trade, well, China is actually the most powerful actor, and it's not close. China is the world's producer. It's the world's manufacturer at this point. And this is particularly true for goods that are increasingly going to be under demand, such as electric vehicles or solar panels, or, in the fears of the United States, semiconductor chips. And even in terms, of information, you're seeing an increasing amount of research papers coming from the PRC as opposed to the United States. And this shift to bipolarity means that, in contrast to 2008, when the U.S. was not really worried about peer competitors, now it very much is. Now we are operating in a world of relative gains concern, at least vis-a-vis China. You see this from the quote from Jens Stoltenberg, who was Donald Trump's favorite NATO Secretary General, but also just the NATO Secretary General. But also, not just him. If you heard Jake Sullivan, he gave a speech at the Brookings Institution last year in which he made it very clear that the U.S. preferences had shifted. It was no longer the U.S. Only had to be let's say, one generation ahead in terms of semiconductors compared to China. Now it was about maximizing that lead. So suddenly you're operating in a world of relative gains concern. And in a world of relative gains concern, to put it gently, you wind up with, let's say, black and white thinking when it comes to the other side. And so you have seen outbidding among the major political parties in the United States about how to think about China. Now, I want to be very clear here. I'm not saying that there are not valid reasons to be concerned about China, or even about excessive trade dependence on China. But that's not how this is being phrased. They're not talking about it like, maybe we want to diversify our reliance on, solar panels or electric vehicles. No, they're talking about it as an existential struggle over what life will look like in the 21st century. Okay. That is raising the stakes very high in terms of dealing with China. And so the policy result has been that we have shifted from, during the Washington Consensus era, pushing towards freer trade, to now, talking about de-risking. This is the Biden administration's favorite phrase. Their argument is we're not decoupling from the Chinese economy, we're just de-risking, all right? We're going to have, certain areas where the walls are going to be high, but that's only going to be a very small yard where China can't play in. Now, the ironic thing about this is that one of my areas of expertise is writing about economic sanctions. And the word de-risking in sanctions means something rather different than in terms of what the Biden administration is talking about. De-risking is when private sector actors overcompensate for sanctions by essentially withdrawing what would be perfectly legal exchange because they don't even come close to running afoul of the sanctions. And so my concern is that what looks like de-risking now does become decoupling going forward. Well, surely though, ideas will stop this. I mean, it's been 250 years since Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations. It's been more than 2 centuries since David Ricardo published Principles of Political Economy and introduced the law of comparative advantage. The problem is that we have shifted, all right? What was the Washington Consensus in 2008? As I said, that is dead and buried, all right? There are no atheists in foxholes and there are no neoliberals inside the Beltway. Instead, what we have is a post-neoliberal consensus, all right? And indeed, one of your guests previously, Rona Foroohar, is actually one of the big proponents of this. And essentially, the argument is that the Washington Consensus overreached, right? In the words of, Ambassador Catherine Tai, essentially excessive, reliance on excessive efficiency made us not realize that we need to be concerned about things like resiliency. And, as a scholar, I recognize these words, and these words sound a lot like Karl Polanyi's argument in The Great Transformation. Right. If you haven't read this book, I assigned this book in my Classics of IR theory class. I'm not going to lie, it's not the best written book, but Polanyi identified something extremely important in terms of cycles of economic history. He talked about the double movement. Essentially what he argued is that any country that moves towards laissez-faire, towards free markets, that is a conscious effort by the state. As much as laissez-faire advocates like to say, the state doesn't do anything in our world. In fact, that's not true. In a world of laissez-faire, the state has to take conscious actions to make sure that the market is dominates society. Polanyi basically argued, you can try to do this. But the thing about markets? They're volatile. They're subject to manias, they're subject to panics. There will inevitably be volatility. And when there is a crash, there will be a reaction from civil society. Civil society will start demanding protection. And I don't mean just trade protection, I mean protection writ large. And so essentially his argument is that will then cause the state to respond. It doesn't matter whether it's an autocracy or a democracy, public pressure of this kind can't be ignored. And so as a result, according to Polanyi, eventually there will be a counter-reaction and a shift away from the sort of neoliberal argument. And was there market volatility in the United States? Oh, you betcha. Okay. In the 1990s, there were sort of and the early 2000s, there were 2 incipient trends that fundamentally transformed the U.S. political economy. The first was a significant surge of immigration, not just illegal, absolutely legal. And the second was the so-called China shock, China's admission to the WTO. All right. And there's now pretty decent economic evidence that the China shock overall made the U.S. wealthier, but undeniably hurt manufacturing sectors that were unable to diversify away. And people living in those places saw their permanent incomes reduced and their lifespans reduced as well. So this is, you're playing with live fire in terms of the China shock. So this is a valid point. The result was a surge of populism, and populism and globalization do not mix. To be clear, populism, there's a lot of different ways you could define it, and to be fair, sometimes the word is used really badly. You just don't like what someone's doing, you just call them a populist. All right? The best way to define populism is what does it oppose? Populism opposes governance by elites, ostensibly because elites don't understand what the people want. Populism is a belief that you can somehow divine what the will of the people is and then just implement it in a common sense way without any of these pesky checks or balances, or in some cases, elections. Right? As a result, populism in the form of foreign economic policy often takes the form of trade protectionism. Populists are skeptical of multilateral institutions because they don't want to reduce their authority. And their instinct is to erect barriers at the borders to try to preserve some sense of social stability. And so that's what happened in 2016. But that was not the only ideational shock. There were 2 others. The first was the pandemic, and the second was the return of great power politics. So with the pandemic, we all know what happened then. There were quarantines that were imposed, travel bans, social distancing became a term of art. And then suddenly you started seeing things like supply chain disruptions and, surges of inflation. And a lot of people took away from that the belief of, oh, you know what this pandemic taught us? We are too reliant on others for key components. Our supply chains have become too complex. We need to engage in nearshoring or friendshoring. And so as a result, there was criticism of things like just-in-time manufacturing and the belief that we should no longer, in the West, be reliant on countries like China and India for key commodities or key goods. And that efficiency and resiliency are, things that are in opposition to each other. That if we push for a more efficient economy, we're somehow losing our resiliency. And then with respect to power politics, there was a concern about weaponized interdependence. And the idea of weaponized interdependence is that if you think of the global economy not just really as a market, but as a network, right? And global supply chains really are networks, where they're sort of central hubs. If you control one of those central hubs, you exercise considerable power. You can engage in something called the choke point effect, which means you can use your central access in a very, powerful way, without necessarily needing multilateral support to engage in economic coercion. And so there have been plenty of examples of weaponized interdependence. The US used its market power to essentially knock Huawei off of the creation of 5G networks in Europe and the Pacific Rim. The US used its control of the dollar to get SWIFT to kick Iran, and particularly the Iranian central bank, off of the SWIFT exchange, which meant essentially it was impossible to trade with Iran in dollars. And it would be safe to say, to be clear, the Trump administration really liked weaponized interdependence. Indeed, my colleague Chris Miller wrote a great book called Chip War, where a Trump administration official actually said, weaponized interdependence, it's a beautiful thing. But the Biden administration, equally enthusiastic about weaponized interdependence. All right? They've kept all the tariffs on China in place. They've been happy to use dollar sanctions. They've been particularly eager to use sanctions with respect to Russia. And I will say, it's not just the United States that is now weary or wary of excessive interdependence. We used to think of interdependence as a good constraint. That, countries that trade with each other are less likely to go to war with each other. But increasingly, among the great powers, you are seeing a shift in their rhetoric. Not just the Biden administration. If you go to China, Xi Jinping talks a lot about the dual circulation economy, which actually means he wants far more economic growth to be produced from domestic sources rather than a reliance on international sources. And similarly, Russia is a huge fan of the resistance economy. All right? Also having faith somehow that its control over pipelines would allow it to engage in weaponized interdependence of its own. And I want to stress, none of these ideas are necessarily completely accurate that I've just said. All right? The China shock, absolutely real, also wildly exaggerated. All right? And I know this because the actual authors of the China shock paper, the original China shock paper, said, we don't know why people are saying we need to raise tariffs on China. That is not a solution to what the China shock created. What you actually want to have is a more stringent, a stronger social safety net in the United States. That's very different from trade protections. In terms of the COVID shock, this is particularly wrong. There's an IMF paper that reveals that actually the sectors that had more globalized supply chains were more resilient during the pandemic, not less resilient. And that's not surprising because, as it turns out, local supply chains, if you rely just on localities, they're actually going to be much more vulnerable to the vagaries of natural disasters or other accidents. And as for weaponized interdependence, the problem with weaponized interdependence is that, much like the concept of national security more generally, states often look at a network and think we can weaponize this interdependence, and the truth is that they can't. They'll try, and then they will then fail miserably. This is what Russia learned with respect to natural gas. And to be fair, this is what the United States is learning in terms of its sanctions against Russia. Okay. When I talked about the 2008 financial crisis, I talked about, power pushing towards openness, ideas. But in some ways, the big driver was interests. The fact is you had corporations across the globe that were part of these global supply chains that were very interested in making sure that tariffs weren't raised, that the global economy stayed open. All right? And furthermore, the other group that really wanted to see open globalization were consumers. Generally speaking, as Ambassador Stevenson noted in the opening, the increase of globalization led to a much wider variety of goods and a much wider variety of cheaper goods. The problem is that both of these actors are beginning to change their minds. Firms are retrenching. There's no other way to put this. Now, they're not completely retrenching. When the Biden administration likes to talk about home shoring, for example, that's not what is happening. What you are seeing, however, is firms that have pretty large investments in China starting to relocate factories, not to the United States, but rather to third-party hubs, Vietnam, Mexico, Bangladesh, Morocco even. And so as a result, in each of these things, you're starting to see a decline in the amount that multinationals producing from China as a way of sort of dealing with resiliency. And indeed, one of the things that you're also seeing is corporations dealing with the rise of political risk and geopolitical risk. It's a bad sign that State Street wanted me to be an associate for them. Okay, anytime a financial firm starts talking to a political scientist, that's trouble. The other thing that's happening, however, is the shift in public attitudes. I actually think by and large the public was pretty copacetic with free trade or with more, trade. However, when you had both leading Democrats and leading Republicans beginning to talk about tariffs and the need for protectionism, for lack of a better way of putting it, the mass public is going to follow these elite cues. And that's what started to happen. And unfortunately, I do think these trends are likely to continue. As you see an increase in industrial policy, particularly in places like the United States, which previously didn't have much, industrial policy will in and of itself inculcate interest groups with a very strong vested interest in continuing that industrial policy. And by interest groups, I mostly mean Intel. But there are others. The other problem is brand integrity, which is increasingly you're seeing firms recognizing that if they have too much production in countries that, let's just say, have somewhat questionable or dubious human rights practices, they can be on the hook for them. The idea that multinational corporations are powerful and can ignore this stuff ignores the degree to which these companies very much care about brand integrity. So as a result, I think the distribution of power, the distribution of ideas, and the distribution of interest are all pushing towards less of an active interest in globalization. And as a result, are there any countervailing effects? Is there technology? Sure, maybe technology could continue to cause a lowering, but truthfully, there are a lot of technologies that are actually pushing towards less globalization. All right? The rise of green energy, weirdly enough, means that we don't need to import other forms of energy nearly as much. 3D printing could simplify global supply chains considerably. AI could do this as well, although really I just say AI at this point in any talk because it makes me sound hip. In terms of finance, could finance do this? In other words, improvements in global financial markets? Well, not really. In fact, if anything, the proliferation of U.S. financial sanctions has actually fragmented global capital markets a little bit. Not a lot, but a little bit. And as for security, the truth is that the world, according to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, now is experiencing more interstate wars than at any time since World War II. So the fact is that if globalization is going to persist, it's not going to look like it did before. The irony of this, there we go. The irony of this is that during the neoliberal era, during the Washington Consensus era, you had folks like Danny Roderick, who were intelligent critics of neoliberalism, arguing the state needs to have more capacity to do things like industrial policy or create social safety nets or what have you. All right? Because, according to him, globalization increases inequality and stifles democracy. However, this is an op-ed that he wrote from last year, which is to say, I didn't mean this. Yes, he wanted intelligent, restrictions on globalization. He didn't want tariffs. He didn't want the securitization of the global economy. And yet, weirdly, that's exactly what's happening. Branko Milanovic, who's the leading economist in terms of talking about globalization's effect on global inequality. So that blue line you see is the very famous elephant chart. basically said that between 1988 and 2008, the chief beneficiaries of globalization were two groups. Primarily, those in the middle class living in China and India, and the 1%. If you were a blue-collar worker in the United States or Europe, then you're in like that point B there. You're not doing terribly well. And if you were the global poor, you benefited somewhat, but not a ton. Milanovic, however, noted that between 2008 and 2018, that's the yellow chart. Or sorry, that's the orange line. And this is the irony here. The irony is that as it turns out, the decade of globalization after the 2008 financial crisis did wonders for reducing global inequality. The problem is that people who originally advocated for global inequality, the elites in the developed world, suddenly lost interest. The result is a shift in what Roderick once referred to as the governance trilemma. He basically argued that, in a global, you could have two of three things. You can have hyperglobalization and democratic policies, but you have to give up national sovereignty. Or you can have national sovereignty and hyperglobalization, but you have to give up democratic policies. Essentially, Roderick was arguing that in the 1990s, we had a world of hyperglobalization and democratic policies, and we were willing to give up sovereignty. In 2024, we are not giving up democratic policies, and we're also not giving up sovereignty. What we are sacrificing is hyperglobalization. Now, is that awful? Not necessarily. Great power competition, even in matters of the economy, is not always bad. Think about the space race during the Cold War. Or think about the degree to which countries were racing to produce pandemics. Oh, sorry, not produce pandemics. Damn it, I let the conspiracy slip. I'm sorry. I had a good run. Think about the race during the pandemic to develop vaccines, okay, between China, Russia, and the United States. Sometimes great power competition can be positive. However, my concern is that countries are going to get too pessimistic. If the great powers all believe that the future is less favorable to them than the current moment, that's the kind of thinking that prompts leaders to believe they have an expiring window of opportunity. This is why Russia invaded Ukraine. Vladimir Putin did not invade Ukraine because he felt he was in a position of strength. He thought he was in a position of weakness, and he thought Ukraine was shifting ever so slowly into the orbit of the West. And he felt he had to put a stop to it. In the United States, we have lots of people. This has been a lot of rhetoric during this campaign. Donald Trump has said, if I don't win, we're not going to have a country anymore. Right? And as for China, China's the most optimistic of these three. But what's interesting is that if you actually look at the objective data, China shouldn't be optimistic. They've had a bad couple of years. And the fact that they actually had protests, despite Xi Jinping's crackdown during COVID in the fall of 2022, is a sign that maybe they're less stable than they used to be. So I'm growing concerned about all this. But, I've given enough of these talks to not end on that slide. And so I will end on this slide, which points out the following. Human beings are awesome. We have invented duct tape, smartphones, and Twinkies. We can do anything. And so my hope is that while globalization is not going to be in a hyper-globalized era, I do trust in the resiliency of producers and consumers to find ways around policymakers to nonetheless get what they want, and to get what they want in such a way that global poverty continues to be reduced, and furthermore, that societies become more cosmopolitan. And trust me when I say, if you are interested in diplomacy, you want to see a more cosmopolitan world. And with that, thank you very much.
All right, that was pretty wonderful. Let me get a show of hands now of how many of you sitting out there already know you have a question you want to ask. Yep. I'm going to ask that again in just a minute, and there'll be more of you. And a reminder that when it's time to do questions, you'll just go line up behind the mic so we can move from one to another. I'm going to start off, Dan, by asking you to go from analyst to coach. So we've got this great group of folks who care about the Diplomacy Initiative, which is kind of big on, in a nutshell, changing the world. And the benefits of globalization have really not been enunciated during their lives very well. So if some of our students are brave enough to challenge the herd mentality and question the rush toward protectionism, what are some of the standout benefits of globalization that they should highlight to buttress their arguments?
The best things about globalization are first that, generally speaking, the name of the game in economics is you want to increase productivity, all right? For economics, the problem is always scarcity, and it's how much can you produce with as few inputs as possible. And one of the undeniable, clear things is that globalization is a great driver for increasing productivity. That's how it works. It's the law of comparative advantage. It means that, and the miracle of comparative advantage, if you think about it, says that even if there's a country out there that is worse at making everything than the United States, both of us are still better off trading with each other because that country will have a comparative advantage in making something which allows the United States to focus on what it makes better. Also, you get more variety of goods. All right? I woke up this morning, I had coffee. Now, Hawaiian coffee is pretty good, but can I give a secret, which is my favorite coffee in the world is Pete's Ethiopian Supernatural. That stuff is amazing. Okay? That's my jam. And, it's not cheap, but it is a lot cheaper than it would be in a world in which tariffs were, let's say, what they were in the 1950s. And, so even if you're just talking about coffee as a good, there's different varieties of it. The other thing is that, to be blunt, the Earth is a single system at this point. If it was the year 500, you could talk about the environment as a single system on Earth, but no way in politics or economics. In 1500, you were starting to see the emergence of these kinds of things. We're in a globalized world now, whether we like it or not. And it's far better to understand the way that other people think than to pretend like they don't exist. And so, my advice is to paraphrase Sheryl Sandberg, you want to lean into globalization. This doesn't mean, by the way, that everything has to be globalized. All right, there's a reason why both parties, have embraced the idea of establishing some barriers on trade with Russia. But what I just want to see is both of them eventually acknowledge, yeah, we want to have barriers, but there is a point after which it'll be real bad.
Let's talk about that. So you did a great job on kind of laying out what is the trajectory of globalization and that it kind of continues to go when you put all kinds of obstacles in its way. So it's debatable whether we're really deglobalizing and how much. But if the world did deglobalize, just paint a picture for us. What would that look like?
This is where I start to get worried because if let's say if true economic decoupling happens, it doesn't. What the world winds up becoming is more regionalized. Would be the way of thinking about it. That the U.S. would have a production chain and a sort of ecosystem that would primarily consist of the Western Hemisphere. China would dominate the Pacific Rim and Asia. The European Union, if you think of it as a single actor, would probably, be active, obviously on the European continent. There would be a few countries, that would be sort of sole lone wolves on this. And then otherwise, the rest of the world would either be areas where you would have these great powers contesting for raw materials. Think sub-Saharan Africa. All right, one of the interesting things about the green transition is this question of critical minerals. I love this phrase. Because critical minerals, the number of critical minerals, I think, has roughly doubled over the last 15 years. So you would have all of these actors competing in sub-Saharan Africa to get access to these raw materials. The thing that really worries me is that the dog that hasn't barked yet is the fact that China and the United States have not gone to war. Graham Allison wrote this thing called the Thucydides trap, arguing that essentially when you have a rising power challenging a hegemon, in something like 13 of the 15 times this has happened since the Treaty of Westphalia, there's been a war. All right. And what's interesting is that you can argue that in the exceptions, let's say the United States and the United Kingdom, partially the reason it didn't happen is that there was pretty high levels of interdependence. And I would argue the one reason that China and the United States haven't gone to war yet is because of that ballast of the economic relationship.
But if you're talking about true decoupling, well, then suddenly both China and the United States no longer have to worry about the economic costs of disrupting their relationship. And that makes war, or at least military statecraft, a far more palatable option for both sides. And given the number of conflicts they have, it just increases the likelihood that a spark gets lit somewhere. And so that's what I worry about.
If you want to ask a question, please move to the mics. And I'm going to ask one while you get there. And so just go ahead and start to make your way there. One thing we grappled with in my public policy and global affairs seminar in Washington was this trade-off between efficiency and resiliency. Rana Fruhar says it's very real. But you say not so much. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Sure. So there is no denying that one of the things that happened as global supply chains have become more complicated is that, for example, I think back in 2011, there was a typhoon that hit the Philippines.
Yeah.
I think it was the Philippines. And as a result, in a bizarre moment, like suddenly printers were no longer being able to be made. And the reason was that the key ingredient for toner was in this, area in the Philippines. Don't quote me exactly on this, I could be getting the details wrong. But the point is that what producers began to realize was that in a world of globalized supply chains, if there is one producer that makes something that is absolutely an essential component, and that producer gets affected, you can disrupt the whole cycle. By the way, this is one of the other things that is a source of concern. If you're a leading edge company that needs the best semiconductors in the world, you are getting them from Taiwan, because the best semiconductor manufacturer in the world is TSMC. And so the concern is, well, what happens if China makes a move on Taiwan? So to be clear, there are going to be times where there are complex supply chains, and that does lead to disruption. And indeed, I think one of the more amusing things was during the pandemic was how many CEOs of manufacturing companies like Ford said, these global supply chains are really complex. And I just wanted to yell, this is your job. Okay? That's like me going in front of an audience saying, international relations, man, it's really complex. I hadn't thought about it. I mean, it was very frustrating. But again, there's a great IMF paper that took a look at how sectors that had very globalized supply chains did during the pandemic. And one of the surprises was that they actually performed better than supply chains that were more local. And the reason for this is that, as it turns out, an awful lot of producers, if they're in a globalized supply chain, are fully aware that it's a complex supply chain. And so they will prepare redundancies. Whereas if it's a local supply chain, you're feeling pretty comfortable. It's like, well, I just know how down the street. I don't have to worry about this. But if there is a natural disaster or some other shock that hits that, you can't recover from that in the same way. And to be fair, it fights our instincts. Like, the idea of efficiency and resiliency as contrasting impulses totally makes sense. Rhetorically, if I'm a speechwriter for Catherine Tai, I would absolutely lean into that. Okay? Actually, one of my friends is a speechwriter. But that said, as it turns out, I think it's a false dichotomy. There are times where if you push efficiency too far or you push complexity too far, you can be subject to shocks to resiliency. But the evidence so far suggests we're not there yet.
Yeah, and it's not generalized. It's just if you remember the pain when you can't get toner.
Right. And this is, yes, exactly. And this is the other thing.
Toilet paper, which was entirely a local issue.
Right. And what is remarkable is the fact that during the pandemic, everyone said, well, everyone knows we suffered, shocks due to supply chains. No, we didn't. What we actually suffered from, and this is an important thing to realize, people talk about the toilet paper thing. First of all, there was no actual toilet paper shortage. What there was a shift in the composition of demand. And this actually left producers flat-footed. So one of the things, there was obviously a surge of inflation in the wake of COVID. And everyone said, oh, well, that was because of COVID, and, we didn't react well, and so on and so forth. It was actually because producers didn't react well. Producers underestimated the stimulus that governments would provide that would keep the economy going. But what they mostly couldn't figure out was that, as it turned out, people would demand roughly the same thing, or somewhat different things. So, for example, part of the reason there was a toilet paper shortage wasn't there was actually a shortage of toilet paper. It was that toilet paper producers mostly produced toilet paper for industrial locations, for large facilities. And, The toilet paper here is probably not as good as the toilet paper you get in the supermarket. And so as a result, they had to readjust. But to even be more sophisticated about this, semiconductor chips that previously would have gone into cars went into gaming systems instead. And so for a while, there was a bottleneck in terms of cars. But that's entirely due to private sector reactions. It has nothing to do with the public sector.
Please identify yourself.
My name is Alexander Zakowitz, and you already kind of touched on this, but I wanted to ask your thoughts about Africa. Obviously, a lot of crucial resources for batteries and electronics and stuff like that are in Africa, and as a result, we see like China investing a lot of infrastructure and that kind of stuff in the region. So, what kind of do you think that Africa in this kind of globalized or less globalized world is going to kind of emerge as kind of a sort of like unified power, or is it going to be more of like a playground between the United States and China?
It's going to be a playground. First of all, there is no such thing as unified Africa. There's an African Union, but Africa consists of a whole bunch of different sovereign states, and this might shock you, they don't agree on everything. Also, one of the problems is that the country that has a lot of the sort of key raw materials you're talking about has been in the middle of a 20-year civil war, and no one has a vested interest in necessarily resolving that either. I think one of the interesting things that'll evolve over the next 5 years or so is that the African countries previously loved the fact that China was now willing to loan them significant amounts of money without any of those pesky things like human rights observers or anti-corruption measures that the World Bank, democratic elections, all those really big annoyances. However, the other difference, however, between the World Bank and China when they lend is that China doesn't make any concessions. And a lot of these African countries are now facing serious debt loads and are trying to renegotiate their debts, and China is not allowing this. And they are burning whatever goodwill they had in the region by doing so. And by the way, I will add that China in doing this is following a long and distinguished line of countries screwing up in sub-Saharan Africa when they have a footprint. Before China, it was Japan. Before Japan, it was the United States. And before the United States, it was the imperial European powers. So this is not necessarily new. It's just that China is the latest actor to do this.
Hi, my name is Mary. You mentioned earlier that technology can kind of make us more globalized, like 3D printing with supply chains. As a PWAB major, I'm especially curious on your take of the effect of like military trade and arms trade on globalization, since there's things like arms embargoes and refusal to trade military tech with certain countries. It seems like in that area at least, we're becoming more regionalized, where the US only wants to trade arms with Western countries. Is that assessment accurate?
Actually, no, I don't think that assessment is accurate. The United States wants to trade arms with pretty much anyone they can because this is an area where the U.S. remains the dominant producer. Now, that said, there are certain countries that they're not going to trade with North Korea. The market's not that important. And there are countries where they don't want necessarily their technology to go. But by and large, beyond that, there are Middle Eastern countries that are pretty cash rich, even if their human rights records are atrocious, and we keep selling them weapons. So in that sense, I don't think that's becoming less globalized. I do think you are seeing, however, the way to think about it is that there are some countries that might have ambitions geopolitically that they recognize will put them at crosshairs with the United States. And if they recognize that, they don't want to be reliant on U.S. weaponry because then that is a legitimate, vulnerability. And so they might then want to switch to either buying Chinese, arms or Russian arms. Not that the Russians are actually exporting that much. They kind of need all of the weapons they can make at this point. So that's certainly an issue. But really, I think what you're actually seeing in some ways, in a lot of places, is the indigenization of this stuff. Because one of the problems is that, if you want to switch, an example of this is India. The history of India's sort of geopolitics is that really for the last 25 years, a lot of pressures have pushed India closer and closer to the United States and further away from China and Russia. And yet, India still buys an awful lot of weapons and an awful lot of energy from Russia. Why do they do this? Because breaking up is hard to do. Particularly with respect to militaries. If you have a large military establishment that is from one country, suddenly deciding to switch to a different country is fantastically difficult. Even Ukraine had difficulties doing this during the war because, you know, it was an old Soviet military, which meant they were relying on Russian weapons. And so these things, in some ways, it actually is of a piece with the larger talk, which is, yes, there are forces pushing for the deglobalization of arms, but there are also powerful incentives to not do that. Because it's costly to switch your weapon suppliers. It's costly to indigenize production.
Thank you.
My name is Grim Troy. My question is the realm of political science, but it might be a little bit outside your realm of specialization. In terms of looking at the role of globalization with American political parties and the American political environment, how much do you think it's influenced by the distortionary effects of first past the post and the electoral college system that makes, for example, certain voters in certain areas voices much louder than other voters?
So I'm going to partially agree with you. I don't think the first past the post system really matters all that much. All that means is that it's a two-party system, and that's not unique to the United States. The Electoral College, on the other hand, yeah, you can argue that the Electoral College means that the swing states that have mattered a lot, particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, have been Pennsylvania and Michigan in particular, and those are classic Rust Belt states. And, you know, there was an incredibly depressing paper written by David Otter and others. He's the economist at MIT who also wrote the China Shock paper that took a look at the effect of the Trump tariffs on, you know, both the economy and on public opinion. And the depressing result was that the effect of the Trump tariffs was, shockingly, they impoverished, you know, they didn't make anyone better off. They made people mostly worse off. But if you polled people on this, in the places that ostensibly were supposed to be the beneficiaries of protection. Again, economically they weren't, but politically, voters in those areas supported Trump more because they thought at least he was trying. Now, I will say, I hear you're in a swing state here. I hear this is a swing state. I don't know if that's actually true.
I heard that too.
Yeah.
Turn off the TV.
Did you hear that? Yeah.
That's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things to remember is that the sort of pivotal states in the Electoral College shift over time. All right, I'm old enough to remember when Missouri was a swing state, when Ohio was considered the bellwether state, okay, and when West Virginia voted reliably Democratic. This actually happened. One of the interesting things about the swing states now is that yes, you have those Rust Belt states, but you also have North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. Those states have somewhat different incentives. They have different attitudes about globalization. Here in North Carolina, I'm pretty sure you guys are pretty big beneficiaries of a more open global economy. You've got some foreign firms that have set up factories here. Now, whether or not voters actually recognize that is another question. I mean, there's been a lot of polling showing that, you know, there have been a lot of states that have gotten significant amounts of foreign investment. Nonetheless, does that change their attitudes about globalization? Not much.
Lost the textile mills to globalization.
Exactly, yeah. And there's a tendency, there's a sort of psychological tendency of, the way I would put it is that when a factory shuts down, people pay attention to that. On the other hand, if their, you know, cereal is $1 cheaper, $2 cheaper, it's tougher for them to notice that. One of the interesting things, though, is the fact that like people suddenly care a lot about inflation in grocery stores. And so maybe that'll cause people to change their minds, but I confess that I'm a little pessimistic about that.
Hi, my name is Sean Norris. You talked a lot about tariffs on China, and a lot of these tariffs have been in response to overproduction in a lot of goods to make up for weak domestic consumption in China. Do you see these tariffs as a response to real threats of China kind of wiping out domestic industries in the US, like the solar panel industry, or is it more for geopolitical gain, I would say?
I think it's a little from column A and a little bit from column B. I mean, if China wasn't as big as it was, then it wouldn't be an issue. And you raise a valid point, which is partly what's going on here is that, you know, as much as the US might fear China wiping out certain sectors of its economy, the problem that Chinese have is that their model's not working very well at this point. As much as Xi Jinping talks about dual circulation, as much as he talks about promoting domestic consumption, The only growth that China's experienced over the last couple of years has been from export growth. And so the problem is he doesn't know how to shut off that model. And so there are reasons to potentially to impose those tariffs. The problem is that the US unilaterally doing it accomplishes exactly nothing. If you really were serious about this, what you would want would be a more multilateral arrangement. Victor Cha had a piece in Foreign Affairs a couple of years ago where he proposed this. You're starting to see a couple of other proposals where if you had, let's say, the OECD community as a whole thinking about this, that might actually be a better bargain than you would strike with China. Just unilaterally imposing tariffs, all you're doing is redistributing who gets what. It's not, I don't think it accomplishes all that much.
Okay, with that, I'm going to give some directions. First of all, we're going to give Professor Drezner a big round of applause.